Hi, welcome back to Kairos Conversations. Last time we looked at Mark 5 and looked at how the whole focus of this section lands on this phrase, she touched his garment. Why did she touch Jesus' garment? What did she think would happen? Stay tuned. We will find out together. Hi, welcome back to Kairos Conversations. I'm Ryan Martin, Kairos Classroom's Greek guy, and I'm here with our resident Hebrew enthusiast, Courtney Trotter. No matter your background, if you're somebody who wants to dig deeper into the Bible, if you have questions about Greek or Hebrew grammar, ancient Near Eastern culture, study tools, resources, feel free to join us as we discover the world of the Bible through the original languages. This is part 2 of our 2-part look at Mark 5, this little interruption in the story of Jesus healing Jairus' daughter, the woman with the issue of blood who comes up through the crowd and touches Jesus' garment. We looked last week at the grammar, really the syntax of the structure of Mark's telling and how it kind of leads you up to this suspense of what's going to happen. She touches his garment and why that's the focus of the discourse. Today we're going to look at why Mark does that. Why does Mark care so much that we focus on her touching his garment? So, all right, so let's take a look at this passage that we're going to be looking at. Mark 5. This is beginning in verse 24. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years and who had suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. All right, Courtney, from Old Testament perspective here, I know we're reading in Mark, but what in here begs the questions that you want to ask, right? Like place her in her Jewish first century context for us.
Yeah, I think that, so often when you get into a story like this, you're asking your questions, you're trying to figure out like what's significant. And as we looked at last week, we saw in Mark's retelling of this account that he's really putting all of the emphasis on she touched his garment. And he's giving us all of this background information of why she touched his garment and why that's like the emphasis of the entire story. And so what does he say is the reason why? The reason why is because she'd heard these reports about Jesus. So she already had some information about Jesus. And so she knew that like she could go to him. And we're going to look at what those reports might have led her to believe about Jesus here and what's significant in that Old Testament context. So Ryan and I are kind of doing a tag team. He gave us the Greek last week to show us where the emphasis was in the story. And I'll give you some of that Old Testament background to know, like, hey, what does she think? Who does she think Jesus is? And what does she think he has to do with her, medical issue here? And so we know, based on kind of like this background commentary that Mark gives us, that she's saying to herself, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. I will be healed, right? So she has this feeling of like, if I touch his garments, I'll be healed. And why does she have that feeling, is the real question that should be driving this whole narrative. Is like, why does she think she should touch his garment?
Why would she think that? Right? Mark gives this to us as the reason. This is why she thought she should do this. Now, I think there's a couple angles to go at this, and we're going to do both of them, starting with kind of the Greco-Roman background of maybe broader than the Jewish religious worldview or Jewish cultural worldview. But then we're going to move our focus more towards the Hebrew Bible, which provided the theological worldview of most of the original audience that Mark was writing to, and why that matters. But starting with the Greco-Roman, this was a very common thing. We have stories of people trying to touch Alexander the Great's garments as he goes on his victory parade through a city. Kind of the saving conqueror, the king. We want to get as close to him as possible. I mean, it's not that different from our kind of celebrity culture today in a way. We have these stories of Franz Liszt finishing the piano concerto and taking off his glove and throwing it into the audience, and people jumping up just to get a piece of something that was on Franz Liszt's hands. Think about at a pop concert today, and everybody's reaching up just to touch, I don't know, Taylor Swift's shoe or something. There's something even broader than the Greco-Roman world, but even within that context, a victorious conqueror, a king coming through, so much power. It must even just be coming off the clothes he's wearing, especially if they're really fancy clothes, especially if they have like long tassels or a big train behind it. Like, let's just touch that, because surely some of that power extends even to there.
I don't know if I would have immediately gone to the concerto, Ryan, for my example, but maybe like Elvis and his scarves or something like that, in my head. But yeah, exactly. And especially in that Greco-Roman world where you have like Alexander the Great, he's seen as kind of like a semi-divine being, like, or having the power of the gods upon him. So them touching him is trying to get the power of the gods for themselves. And that's where most commentators will lead you, is like, this is a fairly common practice in the Greco-Roman world, or they might say it's like magic or superstition related to touching Jesus. But specifically, Messianic Jews really kind of hone in on this interpretation. There's a very specific Jewish reason as to why she's touching him. And part of that we see in the book of Numbers. So if we look at that passage in Numbers, we're told why the corners of garments are so important. So the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the people of Israel and tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a cord of blue on the tassel of each corner. And it shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord, and to do them, and to be holy to your God." So all of the Israelites throughout history would have worn specific tassels on the corners of their garment. And that would have reminded them of the commandments. And it also would have reminded them as their vocation as a holy nation and kingdom of priests. So like this priestly sacred function, along with the authority of a king, is what these tassels on the corners of the garments would have reminded them of.
So we hear fringe of the garment or edge of the garment, and we think very literally, and maybe even a detail we gloss over, but there's already a context for something that's on the edges of the garments, and the garments have edges as a thing, not just an assumption.
Right.
That's great. And this idea is developed throughout the Old Testament and drawn upon by other writers as just a cultural reality and metaphor elsewhere, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, we see this specifically talking about kingly authority. And when we think of Messiah, we should always think of David, so we're looking for the Messiah to come. We're thinking of a son of David. And so if you're waiting for the ultimate Messiah, who is Jesus, you should be thinking about David. And so we get this weird story. Anytime there's a weird story in the Bible, you should pay attention because it's important. In 1 Samuel chapter 24, where Saul goes into a cave where David is hiding, and David had the opportunity to kill Saul, but instead of killing him, David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And then they have this exchange where they're talking to one another, and Saul realizes that by cutting off his robe, he's basically been cut off from the authority of as king. And so he asked David, "And now behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me thereafter by the Lord that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house." So again, like David cutting off Saul's robe means that Saul is cut off from his authority as king, because it's what the corner of the robe symbolizes. And he just asked, like, hey, don't cut off my entire family as well. Like, allow them to live. And David promises to do that as well.
We got some pictures for y'all.
Yeah, we got pictures, just so you can see what these robes would look like. On the left-hand side, Jesus is always in white robes when he's depicted in art, but you see like Pharisees over to the right, and they've got kind of this robe over them, and there's the tassels on the bottom. And so Jesus would have worn something somewhat similar, as you can see. And so whenever she's grasping after him, she's grasping for this robe with these tassels on it. And the kind of robe you wear would denote your authority. So kings had better robes than regular people, but regular people would have still worn this style of clothing. And the one that was on the right, not that we need to look at it again, but the one that was on the right is what the type of robe that Jewish people will still wear to this day. a prayer shawl to remind them where they still have those tassels that they were commanded to have in Numbers, to remind them of the commandments.
I don't think any of my clothes have tassels on them.
No tassels on your clothes? No
I
loafers or
know.
anything?
Such a shame.
Yeah.
Oh, man, no, you're right. I do have some loafers with tassels. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
I do have tassels.
Yeah, that would be the significant even up until this day. And so that's why I say like the Messianic Jews kind of recognize the significance of this passage, because if they come from a Jewish background where they still use that prayer shawl, then they like recognize the edge of this garment or the fringe of Jesus's garment here being mentioned as significant in this woman's eyes.
I love these passages where we've looked at a number of them, even in previous conversations, where just a little bit of cultural background, especially Jewish cultural theological background, just gives nuance, or not even nuance. This is the meaning of the text and would have been obvious to any original hearer, but we just from a different cultural location don't know. So this is helpful to know that the fringes of garments, they are a thing and they mean
they're
something. So looking specifically at this woman's story, and Mark takes the time to give us why she was so bold to do this. She thought, if I even touch the edge of his, or if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. Let's finish the story here, because Mark doesn't stop there, where we stopped last week and where we stopped in our reading just now. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." So, what was she thinking? Why was this an appropriate Jewish theological way for her to think? And how can we kind of tie the story of the Old Testament with this particular episode in the gospel in a really complete and kind of logical way?
Yeah, so again, she thinks that if she comes and touches his garment, she will be healed. That's like repeated over and over and over again. And that's the message that Jesus leaves her with, go in peace because you are healed of your disease. And the disciples are like, hey, a ton of people are touching you, but there's only one person who's touching him in faith. And so what is the faith of this woman? What does she have faith in? And in particular, if you're an astute Hebrew reader, you will pay attention to Malachi chapter 4, verse 2. And it's not evident at first, but it is evident kind of in Hebrew, the connection there. In Malachi chapter 4, it says, "But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in its wings." And that word wings there is the Hebrew word kanaf, which also is the same word for the corner of a garment.
That's amazing. This is, if you know, "Hark the Herald Angels Sing," that third verse, the risen with healing in his wings, this is where that line is taken. But again, like when we hear that in English, and I've sung that my whole life, and I'm not like, oh, with healing in the fringes of his garment.
Yeah.
So like, how can we make that connection, and what does that mean? What's significant there?
Right. Yeah. So this is a messianic passage, and even though it's talking about the literal sun, the sun, it's talking about the Messiah whenever he comes, that he will bring righteousness to all the four corners or the wings of the earth, like the rays of the sun that touches all the corners of the earth. His righteousness will extend that far. And that word kanaf just means wing or extremity. And that's why it's also the same word for the edge or corner of a garment, because it's just the extremity of that garment. But if you're a Jewish reader and you think you're literally seeing the Messiah in front of you, and you know that, again, the corners of garments are significant for separating out the authority of a king and the son of David, then you will probably think that he's going, like his appearance means that the edge of his garment actually will heal you. And Jesus says, your faith will make you well. So her faith in the fact that he is the son of David, the Messiah who has come, is what makes her well, and why he knows there's a specific person who's touched him with a specific intention.
Yeah. In the next chapter of Mark, we have people coming up to touch his garment again. And we get specifically the fringe here in Mark 6.
Yep, it's that exact same word, fringe. Whenever it's translated in Greek out of the Old Testament, it's that same word, kanaf. So he says the word fringe of his garment. Luke and Matthew in their accounts use the word that she touched the fringe of his garment. And so it seems pretty obvious that her intention in touching Jesus is having this Malachi passage kind of floating around in the back of her head.
That's powerful. And again, back to these cultural realities that we might not know today that were commonplace and assumed in the world in which these documents were written. They should matter to us if we care about the meaning of these passages, and especially ones like this that I think are so dramatic and interesting. It just gives it so much more power when we understand the symbols and ideas that are behind it. Thank you for walking us through this again to bring these two parts together. If you haven't watched part one, go do that. She touched his garment is the focal point grammatically of this whole section. In terms of the discourse, this is the focal point. And why does that matter? Well, we just walked through it. Garments are significant. Here we have this woman coming up to touch God himself, his garment, and how remarkable that is. Courtney, anything to leave us with here?
Yeah, again, I think like the Greco-Roman culture, and again, like touching Alexander the Great to receive a piece of his power, that's part of it. But again, she thinks healing is specifically in view, that she'll be healed. And the place where we get that really connected well together is from that Malachi 4 passage, that if you touch him, you'll be healed. So it's not just any kind of power, but it's healing power. And obviously tons of other people in that Galilee region had that same kind of anticipation. And that's why they would bring them out so that they could also touch the edges of his garment. And he let them do it, knowing that like this is fulfillment of that prophecy. So that's kind of a cool way to look at the fulfillment of Malachi there.
Wonderful. Yes, it is. That's awesome. Well, thank you for joining us for this two-parter. Hopefully this brought new life and intrigue to a much-loved passage in Mark 5. I love this passage, and love it more now. So thank you, Courtney, for walking us through that. So good to see the connections here. If you have not subscribed to Kairos Conversations on YouTube, do that. You can get notifications about when we have more videos. Comment. Tell us if you got anything to add to this conversation, if there's anything that seems surprising or odd to you, if there's just anything that you want to know further about this. We do hang out in the comments and answer your questions, so we're always happy to hear. We will be back next time with more biblical language content and helping you see more beautiful and amazing things about God's word. Thank you, and see you next time.